Human rights. They are under pressure like never before. From Gaza to Sudan to Ukraine, conflicts are escalating and undermining the norms that human rights advocates have worked decades to consolidate. Great power rivalries are testing the system, with impunity rising and international accountability breaking down. Artificial intelligence and new technologies are changing the rules, sometimes making violations easier, sometimes making them harder to hide. So what's really happening? Are human rights actually in retreat, or is this a cycle that we've seen before? And who or what can actually push back? Few have seen it up close like Kenneth Roth, legendary human rights advocate and former executive director of Human Rights Watch.
Every government has to at least pretend to respect human rights.
Decades on the front lines give him a front row seat to what drives progress and what threatens it. And today, he's sharing it with us. I'm Leslie Vinjamori, President and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and welcome to Deep Dish. You led one of the most influential organizations in the world in the human rights sector that was constantly, presumably, trying to think creatively about how to use your leverage to do the right thing. Give us a sense of what did you try, what failed abysmally, and what worked?
Okay, well, Leslie, the premise to the work of Human Rights Watch and really the broader human rights movement is that in today's world, every government has to at least pretend to respect human rights. Now, we know they fall short, but this pretense is a critical aspect of their legitimacy. It's a way of saying we government officials are looking out for you, the people, rather than just ourselves and our cronies and our Swiss bank accounts. And so when Human Rights Watch enters a country, when we investigate and document the embarrassing discrepancy between this haughty pretense and the often ugly reality, that discrepancy is shameful. And governments attack us, they hate it. They will say we were biased or deceived or misunderstood, but we're super careful. And we win those battles. And ultimately, the government recognizes that they're not able to get rid of the bad press until they change the bad conduct.
What does that mean? You say you win the battles. Surely you haven't won every time.
Well, in the sense of the reputational battles, we actually do. When I left Human Rights Watch 3 years ago, we were getting about 1,000 media mentions every single day. So we were able to shine a very intense spotlight on governmental misconduct. And they may deny it, but after a while, we have the facts. We don't publish until we know that we're right. I tell a story, for example, of how in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, back, 12 years ago or so, Human Rights Watch was addressing the fact that the Rwandan government was supporting a rebel group known as the M23 that was raping and killing its way through the countryside. And we put out a report, and Paul Kagame, the Rwandan president, denied it. He said, no, you're wrong. And so a few months later, we put out another report showing that Rwanda was still doing it, and he lied again. And it wasn't until the third report that everybody recognized that Human Rights Watch was telling the truth, that Kagame was lying through his teeth. And at that stage, we were able to get U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and British Foreign Secretary William Hague to call Kagame and say, if you want your aid to continue, you've got to stop supporting the M23. And the M23 crumbled within days. It actually disappeared for about 8 years. It's now back. It's back because Kagame has spent the interim trying to make himself better able to defend against these kind of sanctions. And I think also, frankly, the West's view of Kagame has become more accepting of his brutal dictatorship. But it shows that, at least in this era, we were able to stop the M23 from preying upon the people of Eastern Congo for a solid 8 years, which is something. It's not putting an end to it altogether, but it shows that these kind of battles about the facts, we win. Governments that lie, we can show that they're lying. And ultimately, there really is a reputational cost to that, which we can then try to couple with the fact that every government, wants something from the international community. And if we can try to deprive their access to things like arms sales or military aid or preferential trade benefits or invitations to fancy summits, whatever it is, that's another way of putting diplomatic and economic pressure on governments to change their behavior.
You entered the year of the Battle of Mogadishu, The year before the genocide in Rwanda, 2 years before the murder of 8,000 men and boys in Srebrenica, there was a very dark side of the 1990s. You're then there through the global war on terror that followed the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. You were there during the Syrian civil war, the election of President Trump, not once but twice. And you were also there for the majority of what are now 19 cumulative years of Democratic backsliding. Give us a sense of where we are now relative to all these other moments. Are we in a fundamentally different place, or has it always kind of been tough?
I would not pretend that we are not in a dark place, but as you suggest, these things tend to be cyclical. And I've seen the ups and downs. I started doing human rights work in the midst of the Cold War, where the fight against communism was deemed to justify backing for highly abusive right-wing military regimes around the world. Then, communism fell. There was this brief moment of euphoria, and suddenly it seemed like the world was falling apart with ethnic cleansing and ethnic conflict in places like Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. There was a gradual period where things seemed to be getting better, where, trade was paralleling the growth of democracy. But then came 9/11, and suddenly the fight against terrorism justified all kinds of atrocities, systematic torture, disappearances, endless detention in Guantanamo. Then we sort of got past that, but we've now, entered the second Trump era, and this one clearly much worse than the first, where Trump is, largely removing the U.S. as a proponent of human rights and democracy. He really seems to favor autocrats, at least friendly autocrats. And so it's a challenging moment, but I actually am not depressed, partly because I recognize that these things are cyclical, but also because, even when I look at Trump, I think he has his weaknesses that can be played to. When I look at the world, there's sort of a gradual decline of democracy, but I actually see a reaffirmation of democracy in many parts of the world, particularly outside the established democracies. We're this ironic moment where there's a real contrast between the West and the rest, and people outside the West are more willing to embrace democracy than these days, at least some elements within the West. So it's a complicated situation, as it always is, but there's a lot to work with. And there are always ways you can put pressure on governments to force them to behave better. They can be reputational. They can be trying to deprive them of things they want from the international community. But there's always something. And that's part of what keeps me going, is recognizing that these tools work and that governments are rational actors. They have a cost-benefit analysis behind their repression. And if we can shift that, we can make things better.
When you're also trying to influence, the heavyweight in the room, how do you persuade your own government to get on the right side of the challenge that you are dedicating, part of not only your organization, but also one that's, in the scheme of things, quite small, certainly in terms of GDP, the value even accumulated is tiny compared to the U.S. government.
No, of course. A good illustration of the difficulty of what you're describing, Leslie, is how we stopped Bush administration's torture. And it wasn't an overnight phenomenon at all. It involved, gradually revealing what was happening. It involved disclosing the location of the secret CIA detention centers where people were being disappeared and tortured. And it required a lot of argument because here, although the Bush administration denied that it was torturing, it really was kind of nodding and blinking to that one and was in essence saying, we need to be doing this to people. We're not going to call it torture, even though everybody knows it is, because this is what we need to make us safe. And a lot of Americans bought that at first until they came to recognize that the torture was actually the terrorist recruiter's best friend. That, when somebody is tortured, they're ripe to join the jihadists. Their family members are ripe to do that. This really loses the moral high ground that the United States had after the 9/11 attacks. And so it took a while, and ironically, it was the Abu Ghraib disclosures, cases of torture that were not the sort of systematic professional practices being engaged in by the CIA, but completely rookie, juvenile stuff being done by low-level soldiers that when people saw the pictures of that, they were appalled. And that was the beginning of the end. The whole thing gradually shut down. We had to do something similar with Guantanamo, where, at first it was deemed tough to put people in Guantanamo, to deny them regular trials in federal court, to go with these cheap, concocted on the run military commissions. until people gradually came to recognize that these military commissions were so fraught with problems. They were designed really to avoid any revelation of the torture, that they were not convicting anybody. And so we still have the primary 9/11 suspects, more than 20 years later, never having been tried, and probably they never will be tried, because the Bush administration refused to put them in federal court. And Obama, much to his discredit, didn't do that either. So these are examples where you can't call these complete victories, and it took some time. But yes, the U.S. government, even on something that it cared profoundly about, could be moved, as you marshal public opinion, to recognize that what the government was doing was illegal, it was wrong, and it wasn't even helpful.
I appreciate that you've reminded us that it wasn't just President Bush, it was also President Obama who took a decision pretty early on that the right thing to do, in his view, for America at that moment in time was not to really pursue the former administration, to pursue the question of accountability for torture. So we move now into a different era. We've had a first Trump administration. We've had a second Trump administration. Doesn't seem to be an administration that is putting human rights advocacy at the front of the agenda, nor democracy promotion, nor giving priority to working with democracies, if it happens to be that way. Is it fundamentally different than the other very dark moments and things that the U.S. has supported or engaged in?
Well, I think there is a difference between the first and the second Trump administrations, in that the first time, other governments really stepped in and filled the void created by Trump's utter withdrawal from the defense of human rights. Now, there still are things that can be done. And I think that Trump, even though if you approach him in a direct manner and say, you're not respecting human rights, he'll kind of look at you in a dazed way and say, well, what are those? He could care less. This is the guy who's bombing and summarily executing supposed drug boats in the Caribbean. We have no idea who's in these boats, but in any event, they should be arrested, not summarily executed. So this guy has no natural sympathy for human rights, but he does have self-regard. Trump is all about himself. And so that gives us an opportunity, because Trump, what he thinks of himself most favorably in terms of is as a master negotiator. This is the guy who can pull off the art of any deal. He's clearly vying for a Nobel Peace Prize. And that gives us an opening, because you don't get a Nobel Peace Prize for ethnically cleansing Gaza. You don't get a Nobel Peace Prize by turning Ukraine into a Kremlin vassal state. And we also, in a sense, can point out how Trump is being bamboozled by the likes of Netanyahu or Putin, that he is a naive negotiator, not a savvy negotiator. And these are the kinds of portrayals in the media that Trump is attentive to. He is a media hound. And while it may be a little bit harder to get it into the far-right media that he favors, he is not oblivious by any means to mainstream media. He spends a lot of time talking to regular journalists. He knows what the mainstream media says about him. He's watching, and he's reading the polls. The polls show that even his Christian evangelical base is upset by the genocide that Israel had committed in Gaza. So he may not instinctively care that much about human rights, but he cares about himself. And there's no avoiding the fact that the public cares about human rights. And if he steps too far outside of the public mainstream, he pays a reputational price that even Donald Trump doesn't like.
I think there are some instances where President Trump has, and correct me if your interpretation is different, but where he actually has felt something. And I would take us to the moment when there was the use of chemical weapons during the first Trump administration in Syria. And what we were told was that he saw the images, and that's when he decided to strike a limited strike with very little impact. The war continued, so he wasn't willing to do anything more systematic or use more leverage. But the story that we were told in the papers was that he was impacted by what he was seeing.
He clearly was affected even by, seeing children starve in Gaza. It's not as if he's heartless. I think the Syria chemical weapons case that a lot of that was about contrasting himself with Obama. Because, Obama had presided over a huge sarin attack that had killed, well over 1,000. And that was the famous case where he contemplated military action and then backed off. That said, that threat of military action actually did get the Assad government to claim that it was relinquishing its chemical weapons. So Obama accomplished a lot. Now, under Trump, what he responded to was use of chlorine, not sarin. And he did bomb a few sites. But the Assad government literally breathed a sigh of relief because it was such a token strike that it didn't make any difference at all. And so there was no behavioral response. But it was Trump able to say, I was tougher than Obama.
As we know, in our Western capitalist societies, there's nothing like competition to spur some productive action.
Yeah, it's partly also why I just think that Trump's self-regard does give us leverage. He wants to be better than everybody else. And so we can show that he's failing, and that helps nudge him in the right direction for the wrong reasons, but nonetheless in the right direction.
Good outcomes are good outcomes. So in previous times, Europe was more productive, had stronger growth, was able to deliver more to its people. And so resisting and standing up had arguably less of an impact. Now, they're on the receiving end of not only the war, but the consequences of potentially Trump linking the economic lever of tariffs to, you must stand up on the security questions. And they're doing all of this when they're facing very difficult economic situations at home. So the question that I want to ask is, you made a decision, I think Human Rights Watch, it's fair to say, has been primarily focused on political and civil rights. But isn't it the case that really, if you cannot deliver the standard of living, the economic and social right to your people, now I'm talking about, wealthy economies that are struggling in Europe, that really it's the real game that we need to fight and play for is development. The human rights industry articulates that as economic and social rights. I think most people on the receiving end of poverty, extreme poverty, would say it's just about, eating, sleeping, and having some medicine. So it's a development and a humanitarian issue. And yet the focus, as I see it, for much of the highly visible end of the human rights industry in the West has really been about political and civil. How did you reconcile that with the broader problem of human development?
First, let me say that Human Rights Watch actually does a lot of work on economic and social rights. But on your development point, if I could separate that from what's happening in Europe, because I think you're right to note that Europe has a productivity problem. Its economies are not growing. There's this famous Draghi report that outlines all these remedies that have not been taken. So Europe has its problems. I think that the real issue facing Europe today, which is not dissimilar from that facing the United States, is the rise of the far right. And what that represents is people actually not starving. You can't say that they're deprived of economic and social rights in at least a basic sense, but they are stagnating. They feel that they're going nowhere, that there's growing inequality around them, and most important, that the government doesn't listen to them, it doesn't serve them, and it doesn't even respect them. And these are the people who then are ripe for the appeal of the autocrat. That explains a lot of Trump's success in this country. That's Nigel Farage and his reform movement in the UK. That's the AfD in Germany. That's Marine Le Pen and her party in France. And I think the real challenge for the established democracies as a whole is to do a better job of serving everybody, not to be seen as serving just the people who are living in the big, connected global cities. They're fine. But the working class people who are outside of the big cities, who feel that their life is not improving, democracies are not doing a great job of appealing to them. So it's not so much a development issue as it is one of just responsiveness to basic needs in the established democracies. Now, to put this in perspective, though, it's striking to me that if you look at the rest of the world, it's pretty clear that people who live under autocracies want out. They want a democracy. I mean, why were Hong Kong's freedoms crushed? Because in 2019 and 2020, hundreds of thousands of people took to the street and said they don't want the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party. They want real democracy. And Xi Jinping couldn't countenance that because he pretended that the Chinese people liked the dictatorship because it made their lives economically better. And the people of Hong Kong had a very different idea, so he had to snuff them out. You can find something similar in a range of other countries, sometimes successfully. So, in recent years, we've seen huge protest movements oust autocrats such as Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh, the Rajapaksas in Sri Lanka. We saw a movement stop a presidential self-coup attempt in South Korea. We saw, electoral success against autocrats in Brazil, in Poland. Most recently, we've seen governments that start shooting at protesters being ousted in Nepal and Mozambique. So these are the good, positive developments. On the flip side, there are some governments that are just so brutally repressive that they stifled the protests. That's what happened in Iran with the Women Life Freedom movement. That's what happened with Putin in Russia. That's what Pacheco did in Belarus, or Ortega in Nicaragua, or Museveni in Uganda. So it's not like these popular movements always win, but what they show is that the people who have had to live under a government that is unaccountable to them, they don't want that government. They want democracy. And so there's this ironic contrast right now between the established democracies who haven't really firsthand experienced autocracy and are souring on democracy. They're more willing to countenance an autocratic alternative, and everybody else who knows what that's like and doesn't want it.
Although we know there's a range, right? Because, in Hong Kong, they had something, they lost it. That's different for most people. Prospect theory tells us that's different than perhaps have seen many people be lifted out of extreme poverty, a daily life which feels safe, prosperous, somewhat dynamic, question marks about where China's going. But there's sort of a range on that big question of autocracy.
Even on China, it's impossible to know. Some very clever polling that has been done in a way that people can answer honestly without realizing that they're revealing anything shows huge discontent with the government. I think the most visible illustration we had was the so-called plague paper protests. That is to say, the many young people who came out to protest against the zero COVID lockdowns, which they saw as callous and harming people. And they would stand there with a blank paper. And the point was to say, I don't need to write anything on this piece of paper because you know what I'm going to say. And these were very clever, hugely successful. And Xi Jinping stopped zero COVID, immediately. They were utterly successful protests. So I just think we don't know. We're seeing, various ways the Chinese people express themselves in terms of, say, this lying flat phenomenon, a lot of people just dropping out. You see many young people not wanting to have children because they have no faith in the future. There are a lot of bad signs coming on top of the fact that because of poor policy making by the Communist Party in the past, such as the one-child policy, which has led to a huge demographic crisis today, such as today, even Xi Jinping's prioritization of certain high-tech industries at the expense of basic social safety net, so that so many people have to save for their retirement rather than providing the consumer spending the most feel the Chinese economy needs to really break through the middle-class barrier. So, there are problems there. And the fact that, yes, of course, the government has brought many people out of poverty, much of the poverty that it created with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, that progress seems to be rapidly slowing in the midst of economic mismanagement today.
You said one word. I'm going to draw on it to ask you the final question as we come to a close. You said the word technology. We are in a period of phenomenally rapid and very high stakes technological change with artificial intelligence. How do you conceive of, from a human rights perspective, the challenge and opportunity of artificial intelligence?
I think that the evolution of the human rights movement can be understood in terms of the progress of communications technology. Because, back in the day where information traveled by steamship, you could only learn about big, long-lasting problems. You couldn't even pretend to affect something that was happening now. That gradually changed, particularly with the emergence of email. It was greatly accelerated with the emergence of social media. So today, we very quickly can learn about things and disseminate things. And that provides great power for the human rights movement. Now, the difficulty, of course, is the bad guys have these same tools. And it used to be that they would have to, contend with real journalists and real editors before spouting their propaganda. Today, they just use artificial intelligence enhanced bots to spread their garbage on social media. And a lot of people don't know the difference.
And it is mostly bad guys, let's be fair.
Yeah. I think most people are committed to the truth. And it's the people who are trying various nefarious schemes who try to propagate their lies. Now, what leaves me some hope is, ironically, the behavior of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, because each of them oversees a huge propaganda apparatus. They have everything under the sun to spread their disinformation. But they don't trust that to be enough to persuade their people. They recognize that their people are still going to seek out the truth. And so they also maintain this vast censorship machinery because they want to block people who try to evade the disinformation and get at the truth. And that, to me, speaks to the ongoing power of the truth, the importance of established, decent, respected institutions, whether media or civil society, to continue doing what they're doing, because the information that is truth-based remains very powerful in forcing governments to change.
Kenneth Roth, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Deep Dish on Global Affairs. I'm your host, Leslie Vinjamori. Talk to you next week. Deep Dish is a production of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow Deep Dish on Global Affairs wherever you get your podcasts. And if someone you know might find it interesting, send it their way. As a reminder, the opinions you heard belong to the people who expressed them and not to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. This episode is produced by Tria Raimundo and Jessica Brzeski, with support from Marty O'Connell and Lizzie Sokolich. Thank you for listening.